What's a historical fact that you had to learn on your own and not in school? I'll go first.
Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. How are you doing? I hope you are doing great. If you are new, my name is Lizzie.
What's a historical fact that you had to learn on your own and not in school? I'll go first. This is Lake Lanier in North Georgia, and I had to learn that this lake was built on top of a black town named Oscarville. Now, Lake Lanier was created in 1956, but we have to go back to 1912 to get a little piece of its origin story. Oscarville, Georgia was a prosperous black community that consisted of over 1,100 black people, most of whom descended directly from free enslaved people. At their own schools, their own churches, their own hospital, all of it. But all of that would change between September 5th and September 12th, 1912, when a 22-year-old white woman named Ellen Grice and an 18-year-old white woman named May Crow would both report that black men had assaulted them. The police would go on a search and eventually arrest and intimidate 16-year-old Ernest Knox and coerce him into a confession. A mob of 2,000 white men had assembled, called for the hanging of Ernest Knox. He was eventually found guilty with another black teenager named Oscar Daniel. 8,000 white people congregated for their hanging. White terrorist and vigilante group called the Night Riders then made it their mission to drive every black person out of town. Over the next several years, 98% of the residents of Oscarville were either forced out or killed because they refused to leave. The deeds of the black-owned land and black-owned houses conveniently then found their way into the hands of white people. Oscarville would eventually become a ghost town, and it would eventually be flooded in the 1950s to create Lake Lanier. The lake is named after Sidney Lanier, a white man and former Confederate soldier. Did y'all know that?
Where do I begin? I found out that Domino Sugar was created by the governor of Puerto Rico that was assigned by the United States after taking money meant for the island and church dues. Saplings, like little seedlings, took them and made it his own company. Domino Sugar, not allowed in my house. Finding out after I was able to get my tubes tied at 21, one of my friends was like, I can't believe they let you do that so young. And then I went down this wormhole because I asked my mom and she said, they've been sterilizing us for years. And I found out that a third of the island of Puerto Rico, men and women, were forcibly sterilized without their consent because the island has always been on the list to get rid of the population. That's always been the plan, honey. Always. Not only did they do it to Puerto Rico, they did it to Guam, the Philippines, India. They did it to African Americans, and they did it to poor whites in the United States and Hawaii. It's still being done today. Pay attention. Yeah. The other one that freaked me out was I was just skimming through books. Like I was in history class, and there was one paragraph about Puerto Rico, and they talked about Operation Bootstrap. That's it. That's all they did. So I didn't learn this in school. I was in a museum. I saw some things, and I was like, oh my God, that's from the Caribbean. That's where I'm from, right? And then I had somebody say that the number one point in time that changed the world was when the old world met the new world and documented it, which was Columbus and them, meeting one of the leaders of the indigenous people, Agüeybana. And I'm like, why does that sound familiar? And my mother was like, that was our king back in the day. And I was just like shook. The other one was that they went to Barbados too. And they took people from Barbados. And they sold people from Barbados to the Dutch and to the British. And one of the people that they sold from Barbados, even though she's classified as Carib, she's still an Arawak. To me, she's Taina, was Tituba. And she was sent to Salem. And that's how the Salem witch trial started. That's why I'm a witch. Okay.
Number one, I had to learn about the doctrine of discovery. That's what gave colonizers the God-given right to do colonization and slavery. I always wanted to know why they thought that doing what they did was okay. That's why. Number two, about the native boarding schools. Like I thought maybe there was like 20 and they operated more recently. But after the federal boarding school reports came out just in May of last year, like a year and a half ago, I learned that there was 408 of them all over the country, along with 1,000 plus institutions of conversion like insane asylums and orphanages that operated from the early 1800s until 1969 and were used to convert all Native people in America and Canada. It was way worse than I even thought when I started on TikTok, and I'm still kind of processing it all.
Originally, the marriage certificate was a declaration and a certificate of ownership. And the reason why the bride's father was supposed to walk his daughter down the aisle was so that he could publicly confirm the change of ownership and hand over his daughter to a new owner in front of the witnesses. And this is why a lot of racists don't believe in the bride price, because historically, when you accept the money in exchange for your daughter, you have sold your daughter into some form of slavery or servanthood, and she would not come back home.
Africa, specifically West Africa, influences the way we train and ride horses till this day. Let's get started and learn something new. So it's not a coincidence that there were so many black cowboys in the early 1800s. The enslaved people, the Africans that they brought over to the Americas, had an extensive history with training and riding horses. And I know this kind of sounds weird because there's not a whole bunch of horseback riding in Africa, and we kind of correlate horseback riding with Europe. And even writers who visited West Africa, writers, like actual writers and authors from Sicily to Spain to North Africa, talked about the fact that horse riding was well established in the 9th century. So there was the Empire of Ghana. It wasn't located where Ghana is today, but there was the king of the Empire of Ghana, and he would ride on horseback around his kingdom every single day. And he had over 1,000 horses, and those horses had their own attendants, each horse, and those horses could only urinate in copper vessels. They only slept on padded mats, and they had silk tether cords to attach to them. And these horses were not used for labor or working the land because it wasn't necessary. And when the Portuguese came in the 15th century, they went to the Wolof Kingdom or the Jolof Kingdom located in West Africa. And they noticed that Africans were using horses, again, not for labor. So they decided to become the supplier for the West African Kingdom for horses. And by the time the West African Kingdom, the Jolof Kingdom, got to the 16th century, they had over 10,000 horses in their kingdom. There was also the Songhai Empire, and there was a battle that happened in 1591, and the Moroccans wrote about it because they were like, this is crazy. When they went to battle, the Songhai Empire had over 18,000 mounted men on horses. Now comes in Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa actually is the one that has us using the saddle and stirrups. He actually got the saddle and stirrups idea from Egypt. And so once they introduced the saddle and stirrups, they started building armor for themselves and their horses to match. And that is what we now know as the Black Knights. Now back to the Portuguese. Now they were supplying those horses to West African kingdoms, but then they created a system where they were trading enslaved people for horses. And horses were used to chase down Africans and capture them into slavery. The Africans even created a special weapon so they could cut the tendons of horses so they can avoid being captured. And unfortunately, due to the slave trade and due to colonialism, they began taking away their horses. And use of horses in Africa, specifically West Africa, quickly declined. There's kind of one weird reason why the equestrian history of Africa, specifically West Africa, is kind of lost, and that's because of the book Roots. Now, this wasn't done on purpose, but unfortunately, he introduced a character called Kunta Kinte, the enslaved African pedestrian. And when that book was released, a lot of people took it as a true account of an enslaved person, which we now know is not the truth. But this is why I always say African history is and always will be world history.
Tried making a video on this before, but it didn't do so well, so I'm going to try again. The first enslaved Africans to arrive to America weren't even supposed to be coming here, nor were they treated as slaves. Let's talk about it. As we all learned in 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in America in Jamestown, Virginia, even though there were enslaved people here almost a century prior to that in Florida, but I digress. The Africans were captured by the Portuguese in Angola and brought all the way across the Atlantic headed to present-day Mexico until that ship was captured by another ship that stole them again and brought them all the way to Virginia. What a journey. When they got to Jamestown, they were traded for food, so much for being stolen twice, and the English originally treated them as indentured servants since that was their primary source of labor, until the English realized that there was a way that they could keep their profit going on longer, because indentured servants got to go home or a piece of land after their labor. So in 1662, Virginia and other colonies began passing hereditary slave laws that made the child of an enslaved mother take her status. And
all of the facts of history I had to learn on my own. And let me be clear, I am not throwing my history teachers under the bus, because all of my teachers and all of my schools were fantastic. You see, I'm a teacher. I teach history, and the objective of history in the classroom is not to teach all the facts. It is literally to build the context and the framework through which the students can continue to learn history for the rest of their lives. It's also to help them understand their current situation. But I did recently learn one historical fact that I had no idea about and nobody in school taught me about, and I had to read it on my own in a book. And that's the story of the USS Forrestal, which on July 29th, 1967, had a bit of a conflagration. You see, this ship was heavily involved in Operation Rolling Thunder, and they were launching all these aircraft on, I think, their fourth day of launching all these aircraft to drop bombs on North Vietnam. Now, agree or disagree on anything you want in Vietnam. Here's what happened. See, these planes were loading up with their missiles and their bombs and everything else ready to go. And just a day before, the USS Diamond Head had delivered them some bombs, and these bombs were made of an older composition explosive. And they had been sitting out on the tarmac for like 10 years in the Philippines. And the commander of the ship had no choice. He's like, these are the bombs we have. We're out of the newer ones that I prefer. These unstable ones we'll just have to put them on deck because we need to drop bombs on North Vietnam. And in the morning of July 29th, Sidewinder missile from this A4 here fired and hit those two A4s over there. And that's bad, but some things are going to make this much worse. Now, one of those A4s was piloted by none other than John McCain. Yep, that one. Sidewinder struck the fuel tank of one of those A4s. A few people were killed and injured immediately. The pilots were trying to get out, and this fire began to spread. The fire actually spilled below decks because of the fuel that was pouring out, but the bigger problem was the fact that there were these unstable bombs on deck, and as these fire crews and emergency crews stepped in to help, those bombs exploded. 134 men were killed. 161 were injured. This is basically the worst casualty event for the U.S. Navy since World War II. And today just happens to be
the slave trade in the South Pacific, known as blackbirding, and just how devastating it was. Obviously, it's really difficult to gauge like a precise figure of how many people were actually blackbirded, but it's estimated that 70,000 people were taken from Vanuatu alone. According to a book called The White Headhunter by Nigel Randall, the effects of blackbirding in Vanuatu were so devastating that the population, which in 1870 was estimated to be about 650,000 people, had dropped to roughly 100,000 people by the turn of the century. And if we take a look at smaller islands, the island of Futuna in Vanuatu, which in 1870 had a population of roughly 900 people, was reduced by almost half as a result of blackbird. On the small island nation of Tokelau, about 253 people were taken and sent to Peru, which was about 47% of the population at that time. And all of that is just the tip of the iceberg. And it frustrates me because I feel blackbirding, which was occurring as late as 1904, is not talked about nearly enough. Like, I went to high school in New Zealand, which is literally in the Pacific, has a huge Pacific Island population, and I was never taught any of this. So if you do have any knowledge on the subject, please don't be shy to leave it in the comments below so that we can all learn together.
Man, alright, so I remember in like 7th grade, I think it was 7th grade, we all had to pick a president and do like a research paper, and I got in trouble because I picked George Washington. And these are some little known facts about George Washington I bet you didn't know. Okay, in 1794, he signed the Slave Trade Act that stopped ships from bringing slaves to America through the Atlantic, okay? And that might lead you to believe, oh, George Washington was for the people. Fuck no, he wasn't. This motherfucker lived in Pennsylvania, right? So in Pennsylvania, there is a law for slaves that says after 6 months of residing in the state of Pennsylvania, you are qualified to become a free man. What George Washington do? Move his fucking slaves out of state every 6 months to make sure these niggas don't be free. Also, them damn wooden teeth everybody be talking about, some of that's true. But he made dentures out of slave teeth, also dead people teeth from the battlefield. Yeah, he put dead people teeth in his mouth. Yeah. Also, did you know one time, in the middle of a battle, he called a ceasefire because somebody on the opposite side had a dog and it got lost and he wanted to return it. Also, did you know that when he was dying, he had a sore throat? So he told his doctors, hey, I want y'all to drain me of all my blood until I feel better. Within 4 hours, they drained, no, I think it was within 12 hours, they drained 40% of the blood in his body. What George Washington do? Die.
Forget the Alamo. Forget it. We need to forget it. Because you know what they taught us in Texas history? They taught us that Texas wanted to secede and leave Mexico because Mexico was making laws that they didn't want to follow. Didn't tell us what those laws were. Didn't tell us. Slavery! Slavery! Mexico outlawed slavery. And Texans were like, nope, want those still. We're going to leave. Forget the Alamo!
The 16th of December in this country a public holiday. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that's what I thought. That's what I've thought my entire life. But it's only been the day of reconciliation for about 30 years. It's been something way worse for a lot longer. The 16th of December is actually commemorating the Day of the Vow, a Christian religious holiday where the Voortrekker celebrate their victory against the Zulus in the Battle of Blood River in 1838. And before you go, oh, was it really replaced? Yeah, it was replaced. From 1910 till 1982, it was being celebrated. And as you can see, it says right there, up until the end of apartheid, where it was replaced by the Day of Reconciliation. The same Voortrekker that we know for a fact trekked, one of the reasons being because the British banned slavery. This holiday is commemorating the actions of those psychos. Now, I know what you're thinking. If it's the Day of the Vow, then where's the vow? This is the vow, but it's in Afrikaans. And unfortunately, according to Charlize Theron, no one really speaks that except for like 4 people, so I'm going to read this in English. We stand here before the holy God of heaven and earth to make a vow to him, that if he will protect us and give us our enemies into our hand, we shall keep this day and date every year as a day of thanksgiving like a Sabbath, and that we shall build a house to his honor wherever it should please him, and that we will also tell our children that they should share in that with us, in memory for future generations. For the honor of his name will be glorified by giving him the fame and honor for the victory. Amen. You know there was an amen. And where did they build this magnificent building for God? It's in PNB. Some guys in PNB might actually know it. This is the Church of the Vow. And I know you're seeing it says also covenant in brackets. Yeah, some people know this as the Day of the Covenant. This is also that same covenant. Like I said at the beginning, it's only been the Day of Reconciliation for about 30 years, but for over 100 years now, this has been known as the Day of the Vow. In fact, they got so inspired and wanted so many people to know about this moment that they were inspired by the birth of a nation, which is very telling, by the way. Because if you know anything about this movie, you know that it is basically a poster child for the Ku Klux Klan, basically depicting him as Batman and black people as the Joker. So inspired by the KKK propaganda the Afrikaners were, that they created a movie themselves and called it Building a Nation. A movie where, instead of it being the KKK, it's the Voortrekker. That's very telling. So yeah, I only found that out because of my brother.
Well, as a boomer, it's that my entire educational system was a lie. It was built to focus on the role of the leadership of the white Christian man. It often overshadowed Black, Indigenous, and people of color and women's contributions. It, of course, encouraged traditional gender roles. My only option was home ec. And while we did learn about civil rights, it was often through the lens of what white people did to save or rescue Black people. So we learned a lot about President Johnson because U.S. presidents were next to gods. Never heard a thing about Tulsa Massacre and never learned anything about Dr. Sims, who performed medical experiments on enslaved Black women without anesthesia. Women, when you go in for your exams, pause and think about the Black women who endured the cruelty that they did for the medical advancements. Educational patriarchy is a powerful tool for those in power. That's why Christian nationalists are trying to return us to that education.
Learned it in school, but the depths of it didn't hit me until I was an adult. In school, I learned about sickle cell anemia. In school, it was like this disease that's so awful and it afflicts Black people and all of this other stuff. The thing I think I need people to understand about sickle cell is that where it originated, the cells were shaped like that in order to help prevent a disease that was happening in that region. On the Red Cross's website, I'll pause to let you read. So you're telling me that this disparaging disease in the United States was
beneficial to people who were living where? Boom. How did it get to the United States? How did it get, we all know the answer. How did it get to the United States? So you're telling me that it's only a health disparity because of...
So leave your opinion down below what you think. And don't forget to subscribe, turn on notification. Anytime I upload, you will be notified. Stay blessed and bye-bye.